Hello and welcome to Captive Minds. I'm Max Perry. We're back for another episode. And yeah, I'm an independent journalist, and my writing is currently syndicated in Covert Action magazine. And I'll be your host for the day. And along with me is my co-host and our producer, who I'd like to introduce, Shaenah Batterson. Hi, Shaenah.
Hi, everyone. Good to be back for another episode.
Good to be with you, Shaenah. And Shaenah's Substack is called The Red Letter. And she also goes by The Red Snail. And everyone can read her writing on Substack, which is really great. I think everyone should check it out. And today, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about social democracy, both its current political incarnations as well as its historical origins and its frequent role um, from a Marxist perspective um, in how it has often strategically played a very counter-revolutionary role in preventing real social change from of any significant magnitude from coming about. Instead, in favor of its platform of incrementalist reformism and things like the welfare state, things that, i.e., a more humane form of capitalism, really is what social democracy has come to champion, both historically and presently. And we're also going to touch on the fact we're also going to get into and how in countries where it exists, particularly in the global north, in Europe and especially Scandinavia, it's inseparably linked to Western imperialism against the developing world, even as it, has within the imperial core countries that have strong welfare states and social welfare programs and national health systems and so on and so forth. And even while it's doing that, it's complicit in imperialism and the plunder of the developing world. But before we get into any of that, I think it's important that we get into some of the history because, you know, um, up until the Russian Revolution, social democracy, it really used to be a catch-all term for varying socialist movements and tendencies until the splits that occurred both in the Russian revolutionary movement and the German revolutionary movement, um, after which it came to be referred to by Orthodox Marxists or communists as a reformist form of socialism. Social democracy became synonymous with socialists that were opposed to revolution. Um, and also, they became known as, it, social democracy, meaning they were opposed to the perceived totalitarianism of the USSR's socialist model, as well as the one-party rule of the Bolsheviks. But of course, the Russian revolutionary movement, that revolution, initially, both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, they were part of the Russian Social Democratic Party, Social Democratic Labor Party. And the two factions of that party were the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. They both made up the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. But after the February Revolution, in February 1917, and the betrayal by the Alexander Kerensky-led provisional government and the Mensheviks, who, uh, after that initial revolution, they continued the Russian participation in World War I. This distinction between communists and social democrats really started to become clear, and it was only when the Bolsheviks took power in October that, with the later on the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Russians ended up withdrawing from the war, and that was what propelled their victories. They campaigned on, peace, bread, and land, um, or peace, land, and bread, excuse me, and that made, that was what differentiated them from the Mensheviks, who had totally stabbed the working class in the back. And then in Germany, the split was actually even earlier because the Social Democratic Party in Germany had voted for the war credits, for World War I to begin with. When historically, previously, they'd been committed to anti-war principles, but on the purported basis of patriotism and the idea that they were, the Germans were fighting a defensive war against Tsarist Russia, that's what swayed, the party to vote for war credits and loans and the Reichstag. Of course, it has to do with other reasons, which I'm going to get to in a second. But nevertheless, that the support for war by the German Social Democrats led to a split within the party, and some people jumped ship and formed the Independent Social Democratic Party, which Karl Kautsky joined, but also Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, they formed the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, and later at the end of World War I, in the Spartacist uprising, the failed German Revolution at the conclusion of World War I, the Social Democratic leadership, which was in power at the time, I believe it was under Frederick Ebert, they put down that uprising, and they used the proto-fascist Freikorps to put down the uprising, and they murdered Luxemburg and Liebknecht, and they forever became martyrs in the communist movement. And so actually, to give it a current sort of example, I mean, this is why when Bernie Sanders ran for president, both times that he ran for president, in left-wing circles online, there were all those really funny Bernie Sanders killed Rosa Luxemburg memes. That's what it was, those memes were jokingly referring to. But it's based on a real thing because, social democrats who are, of course, very anti-communist and love to talk about, all the human rights violations and, the purges of the Stalin era and all the people that died in the Great Leap Forward in China and all that. They never want to talk about their own very bloody, frequently bloody history. And there's a lot more of it that we're going to get to, but that's just one example of how, the Social Democrats were not only complicit in the imperialist carnage of World War I, but put down a working class revolt led by communists. And it's so ironic because you'll see like Social Democrats now, they really try and champion people like Rosa Luxemburg. You'll see lots of like Jacobin articles about how much of a hero Rosa Luxemburg was when they were the ones that, historically, put that down. Um,
I'm gonna just say a few things about Kautsky really quickly.
yeah,
Karl Kautsky, he wasn't, I mean, he was very close to being a social democrat, but both Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg criticized his theoretical views. Rosa Luxemburg really criticized him for his reformism. I mean, she wrote a whole pamphlet, Reform or Revolution. And, spoiler alert, the answer is revolution. And Lenin in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, criticized Kautsky because Kautsky postulated that capitalism would eventually lead to world peace, and whereas Lenin said no, it would lead to constant war all the time. And I think, as we can see, Lenin was right in this case, and Kautsky has been historically proven wrong. But I've also seen, like, I know Guy Debord accused Lenin of being a Kautskyist, which is a bit absurd to me. But and Edward Bernstein, who at the time was the leading theorist of social democracy, he actually supported colonialism and the civilizing of the savage races. So that's in social democracy's history too. And well, then also, the Social Democrats supporting World War I was pretty bad. Um, Rosa Luxemburg, however, witnessing the devastation of the First World War, she wrote, quote, "The World War confronts society with the choice, either the continuation of capitalism, new wars, an imminent decline into chaos and anarchy, or abolition of capitalist exploitation. But it seems like social democrats always choose the continuation of capitalism and, keep capitalism with a human face or whatever, which to me isn't Marxist at all because it doesn't recognize that capitalism is based on exploitation. And as social democrats as well, it seems for the most part to reject an analysis of imperialism.
Yeah, that's the rejection of the analysis of imperialism is um, really key because um, that's sort of when I think, the really key differences between social democrats and communists um, started to emerge was when really right around the time that Lenin put out Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, because that's what capitalism was reaching at that point, at the turn of the century. I mean, Marx talks about how these sort of divisions started to appear even earlier, like within the specifically the German social democratic movement, when he wrote Critique of the Gotha program, because um, that happened not long after the Paris Commune, which had been brutally suppressed, and Marx felt that the German Social Democrats were starting to make concessions in their platform. But I think it's important that we even get it. First, we get into the whole meaning of the word social democracy because its usage, and its definition have like really fluctuated over the time. Um, and it kind of dates back to the revolutions of 1848 and Marx's time when he was actually in London. Because at that time he formed his organization, the Communist League, which he was trying to signify a distinct kind of socialism from previous incarnations, and something new like communism, that so that they wouldn't be confused with utopian socialists like Fourier and Robert Owen, or even like Christian socialists. And then around that time, also the First International, or the Inter International Workingmen's Association, was formed, the First International. And that First International, it consisted of socialists, communists, anarchists, a broad range of left-wing groups in a coalition based on waging class struggle. But the First International had a lot of ultra leftists involved, anarchists like Mikhail Bakunin, and there was a lot of infighting between Marx and Bakunin that led to the disintegration of the First International. And then you also had people like Ferdinand Lassalle, the German Social Democrat, who actually argued for, against things like workers going on strike, because he had this thing like the iron law of wages, that going on strikes would somehow lead to it would only cause inflation, and then the economy would be in ruins and it wouldn't benefit anybody, which of course is fundamentally not true. And that's actually really similar to like the right-wing propaganda that you'll hear now, about like how increasing wages leads to inflation, and that or that's why the minimum wage shouldn't ever be increased, because it just produces inflation. That's like straight up, capitalist propaganda. But this is something that was argued by people like Lassalle at the time. And but because the First International had a lot of ultra leftists and anarchists, who were doing a lot of adventurous stuff. adventurous stuff, revolutionary terror. In Germany, there were a lot of socialists at the time that wanted to distance themselves from the extremism and the revolutionary violence of the anarchists. So they started calling themselves social democrats instead of communists, because communism had been associated with the First International, and it had, because the First International also included anarchists, it had like that stigma attached to it. So that's why communists for a time were referring to themselves as social democrats. And the term social democracy itself, it suggests that democracy inherently is in and of itself is insufficient, that there needs to be a social democracy, that simply getting rid of monarchies and establishing the right to vote is not enough, that workers' rights, economic justice, and economic class needs to be addressed. And the German Social Democratic Party became really the preeminent Marxist party, and it was led by Kautsky, whose views held a really significant amount of influence in the intervening decades between Engels' death and the First World War. And actually, speaking of Engels, there's a great quote from him that I found when he was and this is from 1891, when he was critiquing the German Social Democratic program at the time as being Lassallean, in reference to Ferdinand Lassalle. And he says, quote, "This forgetting of the principal considerations for the momentary interests of the day, this struggling and striving for the success of the moment, regardless of later consequences, this sacrifice of the future of the movement for its present, even though it may be honestly meant, but it is and remains opportunism. And honest opportunism is perhaps the most dangerous of all." In other words, just fighting for these, end quote. In other words, just fighting for these incrementalist reforms and immediate gains, as opposed to, the long game, or considering the long-term consequences, because historically these reforms are passed, to only be repealed later. I mean, the United States, we can see that with, it was because there was a strong coalition of socialists and communists in the United States during the New Deal era, and that's where we got all these social welfare programs and reforms of the Roosevelt era. It's because of that struggle that those. It's not like Roosevelt did that out of the goodness of his heart. It was because there was the fear that this country would go the same route as Russia and China. And so, but it's this prioritization of just the reform. They didn't get those things because they were fighting for reforms. They got those things because there was the prospect of revolutionary transformation, that the working class was going to rise up in this country. It wasn't fighting for the reforms themselves. It was fighting. It wasn't based on reformism. It was based on, uh, championing the threat of revolution in this country. So getting back to the intervening period between
Oh,
Engels' death. Go ahead.
can I ask something about reforms really quickly?
Yeah.
Reforms, they can be good and help the working class, but they shouldn't be like the sole end goal. I mean, at least to me. And reforms as well, they can also be part of the ruling class's strategy to prevent revolution. It's important to look at reforms with a nuanced approach. Social democratic measures can serve to assuage class conflict and secure the position of the capitalist class, which, as the Scandinavian countries show. Very close to the Soviet Union, social democratic policies were adopted, rather, to prevent the revolution from spreading westward. Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, and look at the way, I mean, it is often used by the ruling class, and look at the way all of the reforms that the New Deal era, or even like later on, the Great Society, under LBJ, those reforms are now on the chopping block. You have the current administration seriously talking about something that, you know, the ruling class is wanted to do for decades, but now it looks like it may actually happen, where you have things like Social Security on the chopping block. So again, yeah, these are compromises that are reached. You know, and it's to keep the workers at just a high enough standard of living to where they won't demand further significant social change. But I want to get back to the intervening period between World War I and Engels' death. At that time, that's when social democracy was really actually synonymous with Marxism. I mean, like I said before, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, they were using the term social democracy, and it was synonymous with the Marxist movement. Meanwhile, in this country, the US, they were called socialists. You know, you had the Socialist Party here, Eugene Debs and all that. Well, in Europe, they tended to be referred to as socialists or social democrats. But as the turn of the century approached, there was really a crisis within Marxism, because Marx had predicted that as the gap between rich and poor continued to grow, there would be increased poverty for workers. However, what Marx did not predict was the stage of imperialism, as Lenin laid out in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where he talks about how the capitalist monopolies, or what he called the cartels, trusts, and syndicates, they started to make super profits through the exploitation of the developing world and colonialism. And through that plunder, that caused the standard of living to rise in the Western countries. And that those gains were not just because of unions and the labor movement and all that, but there was simply, because of imperialism, there was simply more wealth coming into Western countries in the imperial core, because of its plunder of the global South through colonization. So, in other words, Marx's prediction did not come true. And so that's frequently happened throughout the history of Marxism, when something Marx has predicted, like later on in the after the failed German Revolution, there was a big crisis in Marxism, because it had been predicted that the revolution would happen in the Western European countries, and that didn't happen. So that was one crisis within Marxism. But earlier there was another crisis within Marxism, and that was this advent of imperialism. And there were two reactions to that. There was the reaction that Lenin had, where he was trying to build on Marxist theory and address the fact that, you know, this predicament that, you know, the living standards for workers in the first world, or in the global north, was rising to such a degree that because of imperialism, that Marx had not foreseen. But that you also saw at the same time the rise of revisionists in the German social democratic movement. And you were talking about Edward Bernstein earlier. He was one of the first major revisionists who challenged many key aspects of Marx's thought. And he argued, because that was the situation of workers, because the living standards had risen in you know, countries like Germany and England and France and so on. He argued that, you know, capitalism would gradually lead to socialism through incremental steps. So he started arguing in favor of reformism and gradual democratization, that revolutionary action was not needed. And the major problem with that, apart from the fact that it's not true, but there was an implicit suggestion that these imperialist countries were somehow closer to socialism than the developing world, because they were advanced and industrial. And so therefore it was almost giving like left cover for imperialism, because it was suggesting the idea that by these imperialist countries going out and acquiring colonies, these countries in the developing world, that those countries that are colonized would adopt capitalism and thus be further along the road to socialism. So it was providing left justification or cover for imperialism. This is what people like Bernstein were basically arguing, especially since a lot of the developing world, although not uniformly, was, but generally the case, it was mostly feudal. So, you know, it was suggesting the idea that imperialist countries were closer to socialism if it was just going to come about gradually through incremental steps, through reforms. Um,
Oh, yeah, and even like the welfare state in example like Sweden today is still supported by imperialism to a degree. I mean, with let's say the major brand, a Swedish brand, H&M, they don't have their clothing workers working in factories in Sweden. They are in developing countries where the wages are low and working conditions poor. But as to what you were talking about with Lenin, which is, his theory about the labor aristocracy.
yeah,
And um he had this quote where he said, he's speaking about the profits generated by imperialism and colonialism. Lenin said that, quote, capitalists can devote a part of these super profits to bribe their own workers to create something like an alliance between the workers of the given nation and their capitalists against the other countries, close quote. And you definitely see this with the labor aristocracy more in the Nordic social democracies than in other Western countries, but you still do see it there. And actually, the Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah wrote in his 1965 study, Neocolonialism, that, quote, a deliberate attempt was made to divert colonial earnings from the wealthy class and use them instead to finance the welfare state. This was the method consciously adopted even by those working class leaders who had before the war regarded the colonial peoples as their natural allies against their capitalist enemies at home, close quote. And all of this leads to, the working class in the developed wealthy nations siding with the capitalist class against the oppressed and colonial peoples in other countries who are their actual allies. It reminds me of this meme I saw, and it said that, you have more in common with like your average working person in Lebanon than you do with the ruling class in your own country. And that's true, but that's what this sort of bribing of the working class leads to, though, is the illusion that the capitalist class in their own country is somehow fine and not exploiting them.
yeah, yeah. I was just going to get to the aristocracy of labor, because that's where this historical circumstances, the outbreak of World War I, where social democracy started to become politically bankrupt. That's when Lenin formulated his whole theory about the aristocracy of labor, because even though the Second International, they had this big conference in the lead up to World War I, where all the parties, um, France and Germany and the U.S. Socialist Party and all of them, they agreed that no organization was going to vote to support a capitalist war. As the war broke out, the German Social Democrats, they stabbed the working class in the back and supported the war, just like the British and the French. And this was precisely because of the aristocracy of labor that Lenin talked about, which is namely that there was in as the standard of living rose in the first world, there was a segment of the working class that had achieved better wages and working conditions and were satisfied as such with their living standards compared to the broader proletariat. On top of the fact that in many cases they were also racist, they were opposed to segregation or integration, but on top of that, they were opposed to allowing industrial workers or quote unquote unskilled workers to join unions because the attitude was anyone can do those jobs. The only people that should be allowed in unions is this strata of workers that did trades like blacksmiths, carpenters, machinists, and so this higher paid strata of workers became pro-imperialist because they were satisfied with their standard of living thanks to these gains made by unions in part, but at the exclusion of the proletariat broadly. And also, more importantly, this strata of workers started to dominate the socialist organizations at the time. And that's why many of them, and labor union circles, and that's why many of them started to lend de facto support to imperialist war. Um, and they started to become more conservative and right wing. And Lenin called this the aristocracy of labor, which is why all these socialist parties had sold out and supported World War I, sending millions of workers to die in this totally meaningless imperialist war. And that's when the rise of communist parties occurred, including in the United States with the Communist Party USA. Um, and you know, that's when you started to see this distinction between and then the real, they started calling themselves communists again to distinguish themselves from all these parties that had just voted to support the war, and that were part of the Second International. So, like I was saying earlier, that this term social democracy has really fluctuated over time. So that's why I think it was important to get into the history there because there are times when it's been embraced by the Marxist movement and in times where they've really tried to make a distinction. And really, ever since that distinction has existed, since uh, these various social democratic parties that were purportedly socialist voted to uh, support World War One. And so, yeah, like I said, that's when the rise of communist parties occurred. And, you know, even in the United States, like Eugene Debs went to prison for opposing World War One, and the Socialist Party in the U.S. continued, but it became very anti-communist. It was headed by Norman Thomas, and they had a lot of influence within the unions, like the American Federation of Labor, which was ultra conservative. Um, and there was also a racial component. Like there were people in the Socialist Party, like David Dubinsky of the Garment Workers Union, who was a racist and supported segregation. Meanwhile, the Communist Party was like some of the earliest supporters of civil rights for African Americans. And with that division, you had this socialist part, the distinction between the socialists and the social democrats and the communists. By the Sixth World Congress of the Communist International in, I believe it was 1928, the Comintern um, actually went as far as to proclaim that social democracy had become social fascism. And it's important to note that they later revised that after Hitler took power, and because some of the Nazis' earliest victims were social democrats along with communists. Um, so they did later revise that, but it was a policy for a period, and you know that division actually arguably contributed to why the Nazis were able to take power because there was this schism within the left in Germany. I mean, the Weimar Republic was run by German Social Democrats. Um, and, as Michael Parenti writes about in Black Shirts and Reds, um, they had tried to form, what was an early incarnation of the Popular Front in Germany, but they were spurned by the German Social Democrats. And, people, the Social Democrats blame the communists blame the Social Democrats. But really, historically, if you look, I mean, the Social Democrats in Weimar Germany were killing communists when they were in power. I mean, in 1928, which was the same year that the Comintern adopted the whole policy of social fascism, they did that because in 1928 in Germany on May Day, the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, they led marches in defiance of a ban on public gatherings by the government, which was run by German Social Democrats. And there was a huge massacre of protesters where many, many people were killed. It was called Bloody May or the Blutmai massacre. And, that it was that, so there was deep divisions that had really developed between social democrats and communists, and that really, really heavily contributed to the rise of Hitler in Germany, as Michael Parenti talks about in Black Shirts and Reds, and that there was an opportunity to form a united front that could have blocked his ascent to power. But because of the treachery of social democracy, and also there was divisions as far as even here stateside at the time, because like the Communist Party, the communist parties had become in many respects like the parties of the unemployed, and they had like unemployed councils, whereas the Social Democrats, or like the Socialist Party USA, they really ran the unions and had a lot of influence in the labor movement. So there was, but like in the labor establishment, like like the American Federation of Labor, which was run by the ultra conservatives like Samuel Gomper. So there was a lot of bad blood between social democrats and communists, and that really ended up facilitating, in some respects, the rise of fascism.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think it's funny the right likes to just lump social democrats and communists together, but there are a lot of differences and divisions. I mean, just one example of a difference is a lot of social democrats propose what they call socialism, which is really like reformist capitalism, as an alternative to, let's say, more laissez-faire capitalism. But to Marxists, rather, socialism is the first step in transcending capitalism to a higher socioeconomic stage. But socialism should not be a permanent state of affairs. Eventually, socialism should lead to communism. It's supposed to be like a transitionary phase. But to social democrats, that's not the case. I mean, socialism even comes to mean really no revolution, no change as to the ownership of the means of production. It's just like government welfare, lessening of wealth inequality. So to me, it treats the symptom without addressing the disease, which is, and the contradictions which arise from the private ownership of the means of production. Also, if social democratic parties were truly a threat to the ruling class, they would never be allowed to get elected to governmental positions. They would be met with election meddling and even potentially violent repression, which was what happened when communist parties participate in electoral politics in bourgeois countries. Like in Italy in the mid-20th century, the Italian Communist Party was on the verge of an electoral victory. The election was tampered with, not to mention there were violent attacks perpetrated by fascist stay-behind groups which were blamed on the far left, which was part of the Operation Gladio. And as well, social democrats, they're like, well, communists are authoritarians, and see, we're more open, and our way of socialism is better. But instead of recognizing that it's allowed to happen that way because it's not under siege, it's not under attack by the ruling class, because it's not ultimately a threat to the ruling class. Because if, say, the social democratic models in the Nordic countries were a threat to the ruling class, they would be constantly assaulted and meddled with, and infiltrated and attacked all the time, but they're not.
Well, I mean, there are exceptions to that, but yeah, that's mostly true, and not coincidentally. Like for example, I mean, there's nobody knows for sure what happened, but like Olaf Palm, who was he was the leader of the Swedish Social Democrats, and yeah, he was always he was anti-Soviet, but he was pretty principled as far as like Sweden not joining NATO. I mean, he would be turning in his grave if he saw what's happened now. But he was assassinated in the late 80s. And the Social Democrats in Europe, like the places where it has existed, like all the parties historically have always sort of like suggested that their eventual goal in their platform was to ultimately slowly get rid of capitalism and reach socialism. But especially after he was killed, or at least in the, starting in the 90s, really, um, the social democratic parties that are in power in Europe really started to become conservative as far as like just accepting having mixed economies with just a welfare state and strong welfare programs and national health systems and all that. Um, and the any talk of like an end goal of or ultimate goal of getting rid of capitalism is really withered away. And now you have a country like Sweden in the wake of the Ukraine war, uh, betraying its decades of neutrality and acceding to NATO. Um, and it's what you were saying about uh, socialism or social democracy not being an end goal, or you know, Marx really started to talk about that in I mentioned Critique of the Gotha program earlier, because that's really where he um, talks about how socialism is supposed to be a transitional stage to communism, because even though um, socialism is an improvement, uh, you know, it ultimately still bears the stigma of capitalism because it's uh, based on the premise that people are going to receive uh, equal compensation determined by however much they individually contribute to the economy. So even though profiting from the exploitation of human labor power through private ownership might be reduced, the exchange of labor as a commodity is still going to replicate the logic of the of free enterprise, because it's still it if it's based on however much you contribute, um, it's still going to mean their earnings are equivalent to whatever their labor is, and people inherently have varying degrees of mental and physical ability. So it's still going to leave in place, if it's based on how much you contribute, it's still going to leave in place the main source of economic inequality. It's not enough. And so therefore, um, that's when he came up with the whole idea of from each according to his ability, each according to his needs. And that's when he also formulated the role that the state has to play in the intermediary stage of which is to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's really where social democrats start to depart from um, communism, because they reject that whole and not only do they reject, but they also misunderstand the whole concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. They hear dictatorship of the proletariat and all they just hear the word dictatorship. They don't understand the whole notion of what it meant as far as being a working class seizure of power, like, and that's what the Bolsheviks and Lenin really emphasized about the dictatorship of the proletariat. Um, and so, yeah, I think you were touching on a very important point there. And I also want to mention that uh, I talked a little bit about social fascism, but also the Bolsheviks also, in reference to all the treachery that these various social democratic parties had committed with their vote to support World War One, that's when the whole notion of social imperialism was formulated by Lenin. Um, and that's another term that's kind of been sort of obfuscated by historical developments that have happened since, and has there's a lot of confused misunderstanding about it because um, later on with the Sino-Soviet split between China and the USSR, China, started aligning with the US and denounced the Soviet Union as social imperialist. But their use of it was very different from what, you know, the original meaning was, which was to um, refer to, these social democratic parties that had stabbed the working class in the back and uh, supported imperialism. Um, and so it was sort of like a confused appropriation because after I don't want to get too off track, but it is important to clarify because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was like a split that happened between China and the USSR because Khrushchev, um, for better or worse, after the world was nearly brought to the brink of nuclear war, the USSR and Khrushchev began to placate the US and started, not being quite as supportive of like the various national liberation movements in the global South, not as much as they had been previously anyway. And so China began to denounce Khrushchev as a revisionist. Also, they were denouncing him on that basis because of all the de-Stalinization. Uh, his prioritization. I mean, that was his rhetoric anyway. Was about prioritizing world peace over support for third world liberation. Um, China was upset about that, and this rift emerged between China and the USSR. But it also became very contradictory because China ended up actually aligning itself with the US because of that and denounced the USSR as social imperialist and like therefore a greater threat than Western imperialism. And that led China to like support all kinds of terrible stuff like UNITA in Angola and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and then later on, like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, just terrible stuff. And then it was ironically the USSR that actually ended up supporting um, national liberation movements in the developing world. Um, but the point is that the definition of social imperialism that China used or reappropriated is not the same as the social imperialism that Lenin meant, which was in reference to like the parties, the people in the, purportedly socialist countries that were, in his day, as he put it, socialist in words, imperialist in deeds. And, he was referring to the German Social Democrats and the Kerensky-led provisional government, the Mensheviks, their support of World War One. And so, yeah, like you were talking about the absurdity of the right wing calling social democrats communists when these are just some of the many, many differences. And also, I mean, you were talking about how like if the Nordic model countries were really a threat, there would be um, more attempts by imperialist countries to overthrow them. I mean, there may have been something that went on with Olaf Palm's assassination. I know that they say that the Kurds were involved in that, which is, you know, Sweden has actually been historically very supportive of the Kurds. And in fact, um, it's even come up in recent memory because recent history, excuse me, because when Sweden was trying to join NATO after the Ukraine war, Turkey was objecting because Sweden has a lot of Kurdish refugees and people that had fought with the Kurdistan Workers' Party against the Turks, and they've historically supported the Kurds, and so Turkey was trying to block their accession to NATO on that basis. But yeah, they say that the Kurds actually, I think when there was a period where Olaf Palm had either stopped taking in Kurdish refugees or stopped supporting them, and then they whacked him, I guess. That's the story anyway. So there is instances where they have, or even like in Australia, there was a social democrat, I think his name was Go Whitlam. The CIA intervened there to stop him from taking power. There's a movie, The Falcon and the Snowman, which is about the NSA whistleblower that blew the whistle about that. It's a pretty good movie. But for the most part, yeah, these are very, especially now, these social democratic parties, I mean, are really complicit in imperialism. And even in recent memory, I mean, like when people were all excited about Bernie Sanders, um, seemingly almost getting the nomination, at least in the 2020 election, but both times they screwed him over. Because even that's, even that's, they don't want to make any concessions. They don't want to have any kind of New Dealism because that's really what Sanders is. He's not really a socialist. He champions a capitalism with some regulation, some checks and balances, or basically Keynesian reforms. But like, for example, I tried to tell people, like, just look at what happened in 2015 with Syriza in Greece. They were after the 2008 financial crash, there was, Greece had a massive debt crisis and was in an economic situation on par with what the US suffered in the Great Depression. And eventually the Greek people, they elected this coalition. It was the abbreviation Syriza stood for in Greece. It's Greek. It's like the coalition of the radical left. That's what it translates to, which really turned out to be a misnomer because once they were in power, they did absolutely nothing. They totally capitulated to the Troika over the debt crisis. The Greek people had signified or had made it clear that they wanted to leave the European Union. They had had a referendum. And when they were negotiating with the Troika, the finance minister at the time, this guy Yanis Varoufakis, who was a total wolf in sheep's clothing, if you ask me, he could have used the threat of Greece leaving the European Union in those negotiations, but he didn't. And he ended up resigning. I mean, he claims that he wanted to do more and that he had to resign. I mean, I think he even later admitted that like Syriza was really heavily under the influence of Soros. It was like an auxiliary of the Soros Foundation. But nevertheless, they could have used that as leverage. But this was at a time where the prospect of leaving the European Union, just like with Brexit later on, that somehow was inherently associated with anti-immigration and you know neo-fascism, and because yes, like many of the right-wing populist parties and Golden Dawn in Greece after the Greek debt crisis, they had made gains in parliament. So there was like a, a resurgence of far-right politics in Greece after the 2008 crash as well. But it also, the Overton window expanded. There was this coalition of the radical left, which had a bunch of different socialist parties in it, Not the Communist Party of Greece, though, as I understand. But nevertheless, they took power, and yes, it was a coalition government, so not everything they did can be blamed on Syriza, but they did all kinds of terrible. Not only did they capitulate to the Troika, they did all kinds of terrible stuff. They sent arms to Saudi Arabia and Israel. Um, they just totally sold out. And you know, if they want to blame that on the fact that they took power in a coalition government, that's the same thing that would really happen if like Bernie Sanders ever became president here, because they would enact a bunch of terrible policies and he would say, oh, well, I don't have a majority in the government, so it's not me that's doing it. I mean, that's basically what would happen. But
Yeah, I'm gonna make it go back a little bit, make a few points. Yeah, it was definitely with Olaf Palme that was a bit suspicious, and I mean, to me, it was probably most likely because he didn't want to join NATO, and I think it seems like any leader that doesn't want to go along with the Western imperialism seems to be targeted. And as to what you're saying about the Social Democrats and the dictatorship of the proletariat, what they seem to forget is that in Marxist terminology, you'd say that, like, in the United States right now, or in Europe, it's the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And the dictatorship of the proletariat is supposed to be that, but turned on its head. And one more other point, as before I forget, my brain isn't working today, is that I've seen the term social imperialism used today by people on the left in the West, saying that Russia is being social imperialist in Ukraine.
really,
Yes.
I've certainly heard I've certainly heard, I mean, it's very common that you'll hear Russia as being imperialist, uh, or China as being imperialist. I mean, even though like the last time I checked, in order to be imperialist, you have to be an empire. I mean, there's one thing if you want to call them like they're trying to be expansionist, which even that's not true. But like, yeah, I mean, it's just absurd.
Like the US has 300 some military bases around, like outside of its borders. And I think China has like what, like, is it like five or
Well, the
something?
US has more than 800. I think they have like
Okay.
almost 900. Russia has a few bases in its near abroad states. So if you're going to call it imperialist for having those, which go back to the Soviet era, you're basically calling the Soviet Union imperialist. And they have one base in Syria, which was there on invitation of the Syrian government that was just overthrown. So, yeah, I mean, the comparison in terms of like expansionism and having colonies and all that is just, there is no comparison. I mean it's just the idea that we're like living in like an inter-imperial rivalry. That's the other term you'll hear. Like we're in the same situation as like the Second World War and the First World War, when there actually were like entire parts of the world where there was real, you know, like just look at like a map of Africa from that period, and it's like, the Belgians, the Portuguese, the British, the French, they all have they're clearly all fighting over, trying to carve up this territory. And yes, at one time Russia was obviously an imperialist power. Um, and it had many colonies, like, but it's never reached Africa. I mean, it had, you know uh, Poland and what's the Ukraine now, and the Caucasus. It was an expansionist empire, but like Russia, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has been a relatively weak capitalist state. I mean, but yeah, I mean, I've certainly never heard it referred to as social imperialist. And anybody that's, I mean, Russia is also not doesn't purport to be socialist. I mean, it does have, they do have, as far as I know, universal health care, and some sections of the economy, like the oil and gas industry, Putin renationalized that, which is another reason he's really not liked. Um, but unfortunately, it is still very much a capitalist state. But it's not a, its GDP is like equivalent of Italy. It's not a anywhere near on par with a country like the United States. But getting back to you know, recent waves of social democracy. I mean, not just even Syriza, but like, I mean, the UK Labour Party, like, even from the very beginning, you know, it was never an authentic socialist party. I mean, Lenin denounced it as a party of the bourgeoisie and not of the workers. And, the Labour Party had actually grown from, in many respects, the Fabian Society, which had a big influence on it as far as like the gradualist and reformist social democracy of its platform. And then, like after World War II, when they took power, after they defeated Churchill and the conservatives, uh, Stalin said that the Labor government has turned Britain into a military air base for the U.S. to attack the Soviet Union and so on. But there have been, there is a left wing of the Labor Party, and there have been a number of interesting figures historically, like Ken Livingstone and Tony Benn, who was actually Jeremy Corbyn's mentor. And he was actually like a Christian socialist and, well, not necessarily a Marxist. He made statements like when Mao died that he was an admirer of Mao and so forth. And he supported like Sinn Féin and the Irish unification. And he moved even further to the left later on. But the Labour Party, especially since New Labor and Tony Blair took over, which really incorporated a lot of like Margaret Thatcher's policies into its platform. It has no, I mean, obviously it has more connection to like, the unions and the labor movement than like the Democratic Party here, which is just flat out not reformable. But actually that's a good opportunity to talk about like the DSA, because in the United States, like the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, um, while not directly associated with Bernie Sanders, like they really saw a resurgence after his campaign, and they have had several officials who are members elected to Congress. Uh, they've sort of become like the de facto face of quote unquote socialism in this country, unfortunately. And historically, if you look at them, they do actually come from the Socialist Party of the U.S., like of Norman Thomas and Eugene Debs and all that. But the difference is like the Socialist Party of the U.S., it advocated building a third party, whereas the founder of the DSA, this guy Michael Harrington, he championed, uh, reforming taking over the Democratic Party from within, and he actually wrote a very important book that was called "The Other America: Poverty in the United States." It's a classic, and this book, yeah, it says the book that sparked the war on poverty. And this book, yeah, it says it impressed Jack Kennedy and contributed to President Johnson's new drive, referring to Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. It said that a lot of those social reforms that happened in the Great Society in the 60s were inspired by that book. And you'll even see people now like Hillary Clinton like cite this book and stuff. But yeah, like that's where the DSA comes from. And you can just see how uh, Bernie Sanders, like a lot of people are very, very disappointed. Like I just watched an interview with him the other day where one of the women from like the British equivalent of the DSA, I can't remember what it's called. Um, the Indian chick. I can't remember her name. She was like asking him, like, are you willing to call what Israel is doing in Gaza now genocide? And he's like, oh, well, we can get into the what does that really mean? We shouldn't argue about definitions and so on. Um, and he wouldn't call it a genocide, even after all that's happened. And, so a lot of people
Well,
are
I
very
mean,
disappointed but we can get into why.
no, I was just gonna say, I mean, there are even Israeli officials that are like, "Oh yeah, what Hitler did with the Roma gypsies was a good thing," or "We want to exterminate every last man, woman, and child." I mean, they're saying it themselves, practically admitting it. So to act like it's not a genocide is like, I don't know how far your head can go down into the sand with that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, his own supporters are very, very understandably disappointed, which hopefully will mean that they will start to look towards other things and you know, that movement I think is sort of reaching a crisis. But there has been I don't think anyone could deny the significance of the fact that his presidential candidacy and his movement, which unfortunately, yes, does cite the Scandinavian model that we've been talking about, uh, as like AOC, when she's been interviewed, they asked her point blank. I remember, do you want, to have socialism like they have in like the Soviet Union or Cuba or blah, 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 Vietnam, whatever. And she laughs and she says, oh, no, I mean like Denmark and Finland and Sweden. So like, it's not just Bernie Sanders always cites Denmark. That's always the one he says, which of course is a huge, like, it's a U.S. client state, in terms of imperialism. I mean, it's just that's who they cite as their model. And so, yeah, I mean, it's I think that there's a crisis happening with that movement, but I don't think that it can be dismissed the significance of the fact that the word socialism, at least, has been. I mean, because there was a time where I never thought there would ever be any talk of socialism. I mean, the word has been destigmatized somewhat by his movement. But the problem is that now the meaning of it is associated with his definition. That's what people think um, socialism is. And, you know, Bernie Sanders, always one of his major weaknesses, even among people that have supported him over the years, is one of his major weaknesses has always been, apart from the fact that most what his platform is has just been a very watered down version of New Dealism. He's always been very weak on foreign policy. And actually, I wanted to play a clip because Michael Parenti, who I guess for many years lived in Vermont, he had actually run in local elections and was part of the same organization as Bernie. Anyway, he talks about it in the clip. But there's a great clip of him talking about how he had a falling out with Bernie Sanders because in 1999, when NATO uh, took military action against Serbia in the Kosovo War, Bernie Sanders voted for to approve those strikes. And this was 3 months of bombing, 78 days. They even hit like a Chinese embassy in Belgrade, the TV station. They knocked out like a lot of the critical infrastructure, killed thousands of civilians, and they also used depleted uranium, which left Serbia with to this day like the highest cancer rate in Europe. So anyway, Bernie and Michael Parenti, they had falling out. So they asked him about him. So I wanted to play this clip. Let me just pull this up here.
The question is, um, what is Dr. Parenti's view of Bernie Sanders?
Well, Bernie and I were very close friends for years. He'd come over my house. when I lived in Washington, D.C., he came with his kid, with his son once, and my son was visiting me. I made them dinner. Bernie and I both ran on the Liberty Union ticket in Vermont. I ran for the House of Representatives. Vermont has only one congressman, so you can't get gerrymandered out. But it meant I'd go up and down the whole state, and I got 7% of the vote. Bernie ran for Senate, U.S. Senate. He got 2% of the vote. Not that I'm trying to be committed. And very close to Bernie. His last words to me, I remember when he came to, where the hell was it? In Washington, I think it was. No, it was right in Berkeley, California, when I was living there. Bernie came to Oakland and he said, "Where have you been? I haven't seen you. Stay in touch with me." I said, "Oh, sure, I will, Bernie." But then came the Yugoslav war, and Bernie sided with President William Clinton and supported the bombing of Yugoslavia, 78 days and nights, depleted uranium, which has left Serbia today with the highest cancer rate in all of Europe. I vigorously opposed that war and wrote a book about it called To Kill a Nation, the attack on Yugoslavia. And Bernie, as I told Huck was a good friend. I forget Huck's last name. He was a professor from the university who took a leave to go work in Bernie's office when Bernie was now in the House of Representatives. Bernie went to the House of Representatives. He got elected mayor of Burlington and then House of Representatives and then the U.S. Senate. And now he's doing this try for the presidency. What was I saying just now?
What do you think of his campaign? And what do you think of his bid for the presidency?
No, there was something I wanted to say about this. I hate when this happens. When I get tired, that's what starts happening.
You guys split over the Yugoslav war.
Yugoslav war, yeah. I said he's standing shoulder to shoulder with NATO and the CIA and the White House and Bill Clinton and these creepos for a war against these people like this. I said and that's when I broke with him. I stopped sending contributions. I stopped. Furthermore, his salary was way bigger than what I was making. And so when I saw that he was running, and I put on the little thing to see some of the events with 10,000 people, I must admit, I sat there and it was very touching and I was so happy to see it. I was very happy to see Bernie getting up there, 10,000 people, and the powers that be have to deal with him in some way now. It's like a big blister in the way, and they got to deal with him and say, well, blah, blah. And mostly they don't say too much. They just concentrate on Donald Trump, yeah, I think it's great. The trouble is he's still not saying anything about foreign policy. He's still not criticizing. The empire feeds off the republic. We don't need an empire with 70 military bases, 700 military bases all over the world. We don't need to be fighting 2, 3, 4, 5 wars all at the same time. This is crazy. That's all. Bernie hasn't said a word about those things. He hasn't. He's just not said anything about it. So he's good on local issues. He's really, I think he's a liberal Democrat. He's not a socialist or not even really a left progressive. He's just sort of he'd be a good liberal Democrat. But look at what he says. He says, and we want the rich to pay their share too. What do you mean? We want to stop having the rich rule our lives and rule our minds. That's what we want. And I think he could do a lot better on that. And he's going to have to say, it's not just me. I was alone years ago about his position on foreign policy, but a number of other people have brought it up now too. So he will have to start saying something about foreign policy, which would put him at odds with the national security state boys who play for keep. When you get into arguments with them, you got to be careful about your plane crashing or your car skidding going off the road, or a lone assassin coming over and killing you, you know, as John Lennon happened to him, remember?
Yeah, so I think that clip is brilliant. And also, you know, a lot of Bernie, I know at the time, Bernie's campaign staffers quit when he made that vote. And so it was kind of like for a long time, he'd been like the only independent in the Senate or whatever in Congress. And it caused a lot of people that were his big supporters at the time to jump ship. And it's just continued to be an issue. And now we can see it really come to a head, you know, when push comes to shove. I mean, I think with the Gaza thing, I mean, I swear to God, like AIPAC has something on him. I know there's like stuff about his finances that's weird. Maybe they're holding something over his head. I just don't understand how. I mean, I've never been a supporter of him, but I would expect him to say what Israel's doing is genocide. I think that's the least you can expect anyone purporting to be on the political left to say. I mean, that's just acknowledging reality. So this is a really big betrayal, and I know a lot of his supporters are really hurt. But you know what he was talking about if you're really a threat and you really speak out against something like imperialism, you are going to be targeted, and you're not going to be able to, you know, be part of the establishment like he's become, basically. And but yeah, nevertheless, you know, like so I mean, it's not really, there hasn't been a ascendancy of socialism so much as there's been a reemergence of social democracy in this country. But you know, it's something that has to be addressed because the DSA saw its ranks really swell after he ran for president, though apparently their numbers have gone down significantly after you know, their elected representatives in Congress, for example, voted to authorize money to Ukraine, that war. And, you know, their stance on Gaza has been very wishy-washy, especially AOC. But on numerous other issues, they've been totally pro-imperialist, whether it's Syria or you know, the overall. I mean, they voted for this Ukraine war, which is, you know, pushed the world. You know, the doomsday clock is now less than 2 minutes to midnight. I mean, they've really supported some terrible stuff, especially in the realm of foreign policy. So
I think I find it interesting with AOC because I know a lot of people on the right mock her. She's this deranged communist, right? So, and maybe to me, you know, say you're just some working class person, you maybe don't pay that much attention to politics, and you start seeing AOC, and she's supporting things that obviously are not in your interest, like the Ukraine war, other things like that. You're going to start seeing like this is what the left is, this deranged woman supporting these wars. It kind of it almost is like this function to deter people from the left.
absolutely. Yeah, and unfortunately this is what now socialism is associated with because they're very popular. And I know the DSA is not a monolith. I mean, I've written about this. When the Ukraine war broke out, I wrote about like the left's reaction to it, and there was a split within their organization. Like they have this international committee that, you know, they put out a statement saying that NATO was to blame for the most part with the NATO expansion, that Russia was, although they still said it was an invasion, they were at least acknowledging that NATO set the stage, I believe is what they, but then all these other chapters within the DSA started distancing themselves from that international committee's statement about it. So yeah, it's a big organization. There are some people in there that I'm sure are actual Marxists, or at least you know, that might have a real understanding, I mean, of what socialism is versus the people that are supporting something like the Ukraine war. But nevertheless, I mean, again, this is the problem now, is like the fact that Sanders his popularity has meant that his platform is now associated with what socialism is. And on top of that, it's his own followers are the ones that are frequently willing to like go places that he is not. Because he just talks about in terms of like, these moralist abstraction, or like that we need to address wealth inequality and stuff like that. But it's never about an actually transformative thing. And he has purposefully avoided discussing any kind of deeper philosophical terms, and has narrowed it to issues about like free education and the national healthcare system. And that's why he always points to these examples, like, or what AOC does, about, they want to, their idea of what socialism is not like, certainly not like what they had in Cuba or the USSR. It's always like, like with the case of like France, like that they have, a national health system, and I think according to their constitution, it's a social republic. It's not. They say that France is a social democracy, but they have a market economy with free universal health care, but even those things, these so-called social democrats, like, I mean, that's the whole thing with their supporters are upset now because Bernie and AOC have not even, they just abruptly stopped talking about Medicare for all. That was their big platform. But then when the Democrats were in office, they weren't willing to do anything. They just abruptly abandoned talking about Medicare for all. So I think that there's a crisis within that organization and on the left as a whole, because there are all these misleaders. But I will say, it has opened the door to be a stepping stone for people to more authentic forms of Marxism.
Yeah, I think the sort of general crisis on the left today does present an opportunity for more radical analysis to emerge. That always the whole thing with the wealth inequality, that's not a threat. I mean, the ruling class, they don't want to have less wealth, obviously, but they would rather redistribute some of their wealth than have their position of power and privilege be forcefully expropriated from them, which is why you'll see philanthropists and other ruling class organizations talking about wealth inequality, because wealth inequality does not address what Marx addressed about who owns the means of production at all. It's purely in the sphere of distribution.
Yeah. And Bernie and the DSA have even been weak as far as like, supporting like the pink tide countries in Latin America. I mean, Brazil, they've been kind of supportive of, but like, the countries in Latin America, like apart from Nicaragua, like Bolivia and Venezuela and these other countries down there that, they're not communist countries. They're really real examples of like democratic socialist countries, because they came to power through elections, and they have nationalized their industries and various industries, and have given back the rewards of their rich economic resources, like in Venezuela's case, the oil and gas reserves, to the people, whereas before it was just a U.S. Colonial state. And the whole time there have been multiple coups. I mean, this is the whole thing I resent about the whole notion of democratic socialism. It's like the implicit statement in there that like socialism is somehow not democratic. So like we need to, because there's a difference between social democracy and this whole term democratic socialism that like the DSA has, because it's implying that, these are like the Soviet Union and all these other Cuba and all these other communist countries are not democratic somehow, even though if you look at all of them historically, compared to the Russian Empire or Cuba under Batista, they did make democratic gains. There were one party rule, but there's arguably way more direct democracy and participation than any of. I mean, same thing with China. These countries were not democracies before they became communist. But like the pink tide countries, like they've come to power through democratic means, and there have been multiple coup attempts to oust, to not just Hugo Chavez, but Nicolas Maduro and Evo Morales in Bolivia, and so on. But the DSA hasn't even really supported them. I mean, AOC met with like the coup leaders in Bolivia. I mean, I know the DSA itself opposed that, but they've been so wishy-washy. And like historically, like like Allende in Chile, like he was not a communist. He was a democratic socialist or social democrat, and he came to power democratically. And what happened? He was overthrown. I mean, that's been the case. All these examples of Arbenz and Guatemala, like the list goes on. Anytime these more moderate socialists who've just done things like land reforms and given back to the redistributed wealth in some sort of more egalitarian way, and nationalized some industries, they've been overthrown in CIA-backed coups. So to turn around and criticize, Cuba or whoever it is for being undemocratic, I mean, it's just such adoption of imperial language, but that's what suck Dems do. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of the most important points, but you know, eventually, like I think that this crisis that's happening with sort of the bankruptcy of social democracy and eventually there is going to be an ascendancy of a more authentic form of socialism, because it seems like the gap between rich and poor worldwide is just going to continue to get deeper. So I think
Yeah, sorry.
people
You
have to learn
finished.
by example.
I was just going to say those are great points that you're saying about the democratic socialism. People always compare countries I always compare the USSR to the US instead of you can't compare, like you have to compare the country to what it was before, which was a czarist autocracy. So by comparison, it was definitely a democratic step. It's a very, historical and Western centric to compare. And besides, the US's democracy is the democracy of the bourgeoisie, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, and most of the period that they were doing that, which is like in previous podcasts, we talked about that documentary, about the use of in the Cultural Cold War, the use of jazz music by the CIA for soft power in Africa, soundtrack to a coup d'etat. At the very time they were doing that, like at the height of the Cold War, when the U.S. was saying, the USSR is an oppressive dictatorship, they were at the very same time the treatment. Khrushchev pointed it out at the UN, the treatment of Black Americans, and so yeah, I mean the U.S. I mean had to get off its high horse, um, and especially when you consider like all the imperialist wars they were waging. I mean, this whole talk about dictatorship in communist countries, it means nothing coming from the United States and the Western European countries. But yeah, I think this has been a great discussion. And I just I want to remind our viewers and listeners that they can, if you're following us on Substack, that we have a YouTube channel that there's a link to, you can follow. If you're watching us on YouTube, we have a Substack. It's under shaenahbatterson.substack.com. Also, you can follow us on Twitter, which is Captive Minds X. These are 3 places that you can get updates on our forthcoming episodes. Please like and comment this video, and we'd love to have your feedback about our discussion on social democracy. Shaenah, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I really liked how you were pointing out about the US empire's total hypocrisy. I mean, considering the country that had the most brutal white supremacist regime against Black people, segregation well into the 20th century, has installed military dictators around the globe to then be going, oh, this country isn't democratic. It's absurd. So that's my final thought, I guess.
Yeah, and the whole notion that democracy is only through, the Western liberal style of, electing, as if the whole electoral system itself is not compromised by capitalism, by the ruling class. I mean, elections are bought and paid for in terms of who controls the means of communication, how educated. If you don't have an educated population, how could you possibly call it a democracy to begin with? People have to think about this stuff. Yes, it's a very easy, simple narrative when it's like, well, this country has elections, this country doesn't, so therefore, blah, 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 blah. It's a lot more complicated than that. And the historical context, the social context, that's what they don't want you to think about. And that's what they've been using, demonizing Marxism and socialism and communism ever since the Russian Revolution happened. That's what they've been doing. And unfortunately, social democrats have been the ones on the so-called left that have fed into that propaganda. And in many cases, historically, like in the lead up to Hitler's ascension to power, it actually ended up enabling fascism. And one thing we didn't discuss, I guess my final thought is like, in the 1930s, they did, after that happened, and there's actually even stories that like after Hitler came to power in the concentration camps that they put people on the left in, that there was like communists and social democrats fighting each other, like, no, it's your fault that Hitler came to power. No, it's your fault. That's the situation that they ended up in, probably before they were both executed. But after that failure in Germany, they did, in the 1930s, there was the Popular Front strategy, which was a coalition of, against European fascism. And we had it in this country. The Communist Party they were instrumental in Roosevelt's coming to power. And that's, like I was saying earlier, the reason that we got Social Security and Medicare and all that was not because of the goodness of Roosevelt's heart. It was because of the militancy and the powerful coalition of socialists and communists. And who tried to disrupt that? Anarchists and Trotskyists. And we're going to have episodes about those political tendencies as well in the future. So stay tuned. But thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on Captive Minds.